Hi everyone. Uh, Today I'd like to talk about Joseph Brodsky's relationships with politics and as a person and a poet and how it evolved in the course of his time. In his introduction to the poems by his friend, the Lithuanian poet, and my teacher, Thomas Vencela, Brodsky traced back the coming to consciousness of his generation to one political event, or better say, a political defeat of his side, or the side with which he associated himself. Brodsky connected their intellectual awakening with the crashing down of the Hungarian uprising by the Soviet tanks. It is fascinating to see how Brodsky created for himself a Russian-English poetic genealogy, identifying on the one hand with Pushkin, Pleiad, and on the other with Auden's group, and kind of equating the Hungarian rebellion of 1956 with the Decembrist revolt in 1825 and the defeat of the Spanish Republic with which Auden's group had identified. But the overriding feeling is that of profound disillusionment with politics. Yet, in the West, Brodsky became known for political reasons. When the transcripts of his Kafkaesque trial, made by the journalist Frida Viktorova, were smuggled abroad and appeared in print, turning him into the next cause célèbre after Pasternak's Zhivago affair in 1958, just 6 years prior to that. And already 2 days ago, Shama Shahadat brought up this quoted, off-quoted passage, but Adboga means in Russian God-given talent, very normal phrase, but in the context of the official Marxist atheist ideology, it acquired a symbolic meaning, which was later blown out of proportion by journalists in the Cold War situation. But if anything, the use of this expression in the Soviet trial shows how strongly Brodsky deviated from the official language. Contemporaries observed that Brodsky was an apolitical poet. For instance, Russian writer, dissident Lydia Chukovskaya, who alongside Anna Akhmatova actively campaigned for Brodsky's release, argued in her diaries that he was totally harmless to the regime because he was not anti-Soviet, but a-Soviet, meaning that he was apolitical. And his first American translator, George Klein, doubled down on that. And the same was reiterated by W.H. Auden in his foreword to Brodsky's selected poems, translated by Klein. Auden, however, shrewdly noted that this defiantly apolitical attitude was precisely the reason why the Soviet regime was at him, was so angry with him. He was not really harmless. In 1965, at the time when Brodsky was serving his Arctic labor confinement, the major 20th century Polish Jewish poet Alexander Wat, who spent time in Stalin's prisons, but later managed to escape to the West, came to Berkeley and spoke with Czesław Miłosz. Wat argued that in order to revive Russian literature after Stalin, one had to abandon the language of politics altogether. Wat singled out Brodsky alongside with Tertsynyavsky and Solzhenitsyn as the authors who managed to do just that. And each of them came on the receiving end of political persecution in Russia. Miłosz must have remembered Wat's words when they met in the wake of the martial law in Poland. In 1981, they met in New York City at a panel discussion, and Miłosz asked Brodsky directly whether he thought his non-political poetry was a political act. Brodsky is, as is often was, evasive, but said that he tried to ignore the state, to do nothing, didn't want to do anything to do with it, neither with its programs or ideology, but in particular with the languages employed. This sort of Brodsky's behavior, the attempts to not to struggle with the regime, but to ignore it, was oft mythologized. But as Hannah Arendt suggests, in a totalitarian situation or post-totalitarian situation, if you wish, such behavior is deemed as dangerous to the powers that be. And in fact, Brodsky spent time in prisons and mental institutions, in Arctic labor exile, was subjected to constant KGB surveillance, prevented from publishing his poetry, shunned by any official venue, and was eventually forced out of the country for good. So the regime didn't think he was harmless. And because of this non-political stance, his Lithuanian friend Romas Katilius remembers how surprised he was when at the end of August 1968, Brodsky showed him a poem on the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia, and that which moved Brodsky so much, angered him so much, that he tried to do something, Katilius says, that he had never done before, to write a poem on a burning political topic. And I'm going to read this poem to you in Russian, and you have an English translation on the slide. За Саву, Драву и Мораву, за Лабу, за Дунай, за Волтаву, за реки символы свободы, за то, что пришлым эти воды не вычерпать солдатской каской, за то, что не впадают в Каспий, вспять бежать им не по нраву, за то, что русскому удаву не поддается чешский кролик, за то, что в Праге крутят ролик опять времен протектората, за то, что Каин вспомнил брата и в ночь сварганил переправу, за наш позор, за вашу славу. Well, he mentions the times of protectorate, the Nazi annexation of Czechoslovakia in 1938, and in fact, this poem harks back to Tsvetaeva's poems written on that occasion. But the political situation was evolving rapidly, and the words "to your glory" remained hanging in the air. The cause was defeated and somewhat compromised by fate. And Brodsky left the poem abandoned and said that it wasn't clear what to write it about. A response of his fellow poet close to his poetic circle, Natalia Gorbanevskaya, was to the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia was very different. Gorbanevsky was an active dissident, according to Venslova, who knew both of them. Brodsky approved of political dissent on principle, but didn't deem it an appropriate activity for a poet. Well, what happened alongside other 7 heroes, she took part in the single operation of the Soviet Union against the invasion, was arrested within minutes, and although she was a mother of 2 small children, was put into an insane asylum, where she spent more than 3 years suffering the torture at the hands of the Soviet punitive psychiatry. And when Brodsky was exiled from Russia, and one of his first published addresses in Michigan was in support of Gorbanevskaya, but he lamented there that the police drama, as he called it, obfuscated her stature as a poet. He said, the consciousness of even the informed reader, the simple cliche comes to mind. Dissidence also writes poetry, and this is too bad because she is one of the best poems. And poets in Russia and political themes occupy an extremely modest place in his work. And Brodsky was right to be worried because Gorbanevsky is very little known as a poet in her country of origin, but some people sort of worship her as a hero for that demonstration and for what she went through because of that. And because Brodsky saw the danger of politics obfuscating the poetry, he also tried constantly to undermine what he had gone through himself back in Russia, especially in his labor confinement. But I would argue that something changed in 1974, because in 1972, Brodsky came to Austria and then in the company of Auden, and they became friendly, and this was sort of the most important encounter in his life, as he describes it, comparing it to encounter with Akhmatova. And at the end of 73, Auden died, and Stephen Spender, his long-standing friend, compiled this volume in tribute of Auden, solicited a poem by Brodsky, which Brodsky later regretted. He didn't think that his English was up to the task yet. But in this volume, Spender praised Auden's poem on the invasion of Czechoslovakia, which Alisa mentioned yesterday. And he called it an authoritative summation of the invasion in words that have the axe edge of a public execution. And we know that Brodsky was very competitive and saw Auden as a model. And I would argue that this was sort of one of the reasons why he wrote several, not too many, but several poems on political occasions in his while living in America. Well, the first one was very controversial, on the death of Marshal Zhukov, who was Stalin's henchman, but was sort of leading the Red Army in its defeat of the Nazi army. The next one was on the Soviet invasion of on the Soviets' invasion of Afghanistan. And then there is sort of a number of Audenesque poems, which very much are pastiche or imitation, adaptation of Brodsky's poems. Well, a martial law carol, the Berlin Wall tune, Bosnia tune, that follow the tradition of Auden's Refugee Blues for September 39. It's ironic that Auden discarded this poem for September 39, and Brodsky dedicated it a line-by-line analysis, treating it as the most important 20th century poem. And of course, well, some poems were were successful as a martial law carol, but it's also personal, because he knew two people, Andrzej Drawicz and Voroshilsky, who were arrested. But other poems, such as on the independence of Ukraine, became very controversial. Wenzel remembered persuading Brodsky not to publish it. It is an unpublished poem. I'm not going to quote from it, but in 2014, it became controversial in the context of Russian annexation of Crimea. In the original poem, Brodsky vented his negative feelings about the event, but this gave sort of reason to Dmitry Bychov an opportunity to undermine Brodsky, describe him as sort of the poet of Russian world, of Russian empire, sort of Putin's Russian world. Well, this doesn't pass the smell test. I think that Brodsky wouldn't see eye to eye with Putin. In fact, Vensler remembered that he admitted to him that that every action of his was colored by his resistance, desire to defeat the Soviet totalitarian empire. And when it collapsed, Brodsky reacted very positively. So it's a positive thing in an interview. However, in Independence of Ukraine poem, Brodsky lamented that at the moment of victory of the totalitarian rule, Ukraine, as it were, abandoned Russia instead of sort of uniting their forces and rebuilding the country together. But the question is, of course, what kind of country? But Brodsky becomes very personal and bitter in this poem, and of course, 20 years later, it came to haunt him. And the question is, I would say, that maybe Brodsky lost his caution of that the danger for a poet of getting too much enmeshed in politics is too big. In the case of this poem in particular, showed that even after 20 years after his death, his reputation of the freedom fighter could be tarnished by this one poem. Well, I would like to comment on it more after my presentation. I think it's ended now. Thank you very much.